Little lifesavers, the wonders of your little inner tube that floats down the canals and creeks and bayous of life. Okay, more like the bayous of your blood vessels is the red blood cell, aka the erythrocyte, RBCs, all that wonderfulness. They're your very best friend. In this video, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about them and how they work. But first, let's reference something that we had discussed in the last video. So remember that hemopoiesis and hematopoiesis just means that you can differentiate any type of the formed elements or cells, whether it be white blood cells, megakaryocytes, or the red blood cells. There is a term that is specific for if you want to talk about the creation of red blood cells. That is called erythropoiesis. Erythropoiesis stems from the name erythrocyte. Remember that a red blood cell, another name for a red blood cell is erythrocyte. So when I say erythropoiesis, I am saying red blood cells. And when I'm saying hematopoiesis, I'm saying blood cells just in general. Now, there are hormones that do kick in and help really develop those red blood cells. And that hormone is erythropoietin. Now, here's a blah, blah, blah term right here, released by the kidneys in response to hypoxia, hypoxia meaning a lack of oxygen, which then stimulates this erythropoietin, stimulating these stem cells to make into erythrocytes. All that wording is just another way. Here's a graph that just describes that wording a little bit better. So we got the kidneys. Kind of makes sense that we're going to want to use kidneys as a sensory for oxygen, right? If we want something going on. Lungs, you always see oxygen unless you have some type of detrimental issue. Maybe you got something clogged up, you got some asthma or something like that. It would make more sense to get more internal that wouldn't really see that response to oxygen. So, and because kidney sees tons and tons of blood, like it sees your body's blood content very, very frequently, it kind of makes sense to have these sensory cells hanging out in your kidneys. So if it senses hypoxia, aka you have a prolonged amount of lack of oxygen, it will release erythropoietin into your blood. That erythropoietin will then carry out or come to that red bone marrow, which will then interact with the CFU-E. You don't really need to know that the CFU-E, just know that erythropoietin comes into one of these stem cells and then instigates further propagation or creation of these stem cells. It does take a little while to create these stem cells or make them go on, but they do eventually cause the release and creation of these reticulocytes. The reticulocytes are your immature red blood cells. They enter into circulation and become mature after 2 days, but they do have to have that nucleus ejected. Afterwards, after it's become nice and proper, mature, it does become a red blood cell, aka erythrocyte, and that erythrocyte will float around into your blood for 120 days. Now, this concept is kind of well understood in all types of sports. If you're trying to climb Mount Everest, you go to a base camp, and you stay at base camp for a week at least. That way, your body can acclimate to the very not so dense oxygen that you have down here at 0 feet or about 50 feet above sea level here in good old New Orleans, or below sea level, in fact, in some cases. That way, your body senses that, the kidneys sense that hypoxia, create that erythropoietin, and it gives it a few days to create more red blood cells. In other sports, like football or running or anything like that, they've realized that blood doping, which is really spinning down your red blood cells and re-injecting them days later, is a little bit illegal, but there's a way around it. You can make yourself hypoxic. You put on a mask, you breathe in more of your carbon dioxide that you've created, then and decrease those levels of oxygen, thus giving your body a sense of hypoxia, which then increases the amount of red blood cells that can carry your oxygen. You remove the mask later on, you got a high concentration of blood that can carry out your oxygen and help you carry out your metabolic processes just fine. Just an FYI. Now, there are some characteristics about red blood cells that you do need to know about. For instance, inside red blood cells, there is something called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the part of the red blood cell that carries that oxygen. Hemoglobin is made up of a heme group, which is set inside some iron. And the hemoglobin has 4 hemes. Let's go ahead and just switch over to that picture real quick. So here's a hemoglobin molecule right here. These little blue things are a bunch of globins, or 2 globins put together, and then nestled in between them you see 4 heme groups. Each one of these heme groups right here, this is your heme group, and if it has an iron, in this case it has an iron inserted into it. Each one of these can carry 1 oxygen molecule. Therefore, the question is, how many oxygen molecules can be carried per hemoglobin? Well, let's give it a go. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. 4 oxygen molecules can be attached to a hemoglobin. Now, red blood cells have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these hemoglobin molecules, which means that they can carry millions to hundreds of millions and possibly even billions of molecules of oxygen in them. The shape, this little, I would say, inner tube again, helps increase that surface area, which allows that more hemoglobins to be exposed to that surface area and allow it to attach to more oxygen. If it were a flat or a circular cell or a spherical cell, you're decreasing that surface area, which means less oxygen will become attached to all the hemoglobin molecules. It's just a smart little design. There is some other factors that a hemoglobin does play in the role of blood flow. It also increases and blood pressure by releasing nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator, aka you get your blood vessels a little bit wider. The wider they go, the more oxygen, the more blood goes through, the more red blood cells go through. More red blood cells go through means more oxygen gets carried through. Now, this next gray bullet point right here is talking about something that's not incorporated into hemoglobin, but it is an essential and important part and feature of red blood cells. It's called the carbonic anhydrase, which we'll get into a lot more detail coming up in the respiratory section. But for now, all you need to know about carbonic anhydrase is it's an enzyme that's inside a red blood cell that converts carbon dioxide into water and combines carbon dioxide and water, carbon dioxide and water into carbonic acid. Now, there is a reason why you have to have this hormone, this enzyme in your cell, because the heme groups really, really like oxygen, but when you stick on a carbon onto that 2 oxygen, it doesn't work out so well. They don't like really holding on to it. So carbon dioxide is loose, and carbon dioxide doesn't like being loose as a gas in your blood or in your plasma, so it's easy just to change it into H2CO3 or carbonic acid. Again, red blood cells only live for about 120 days. These cells become fatigued, worn, tired out, and eventually the spleen and liver, there's some macrophages in those that see these dead or dying cells and go, delicious, I'm going to eat it. And they eat them, they digest them, and they break them down and use the byproducts or send out the products depending on how usable they are, recycle them, reuse them, and in some cases, trash them. There is a little figure that was provided by the book that's quite nice in describing how this goes. First off, you got the bone marrow hanging out in your femur with erythropoietin, vitamin B12, globin, and some iron. You stick it all together into a red blood cell, and it gets circulated out for 120 days. After the 120 days, usually those red blood cells are dying or dead and get phagocytized. Now the globins, which is a protein, ooh, so wonderful little proteins, are just re-diced up, sent out again out into the wild blue yonder to be reused in other protein synthesis. The heme group, remember that heme group, which is that aromatic molecule, that molecule that was kind of all those rings with an iron smack dab in the middle, has to be processed in a different way. We're going to focus in on iron first. Iron has to be transferred to different places that it's needed or if it's stored. Iron is really well loved by our body, as well as it's really well loved by bacteria. If bacteria get a hold of that iron, we're in an uh-oh type of situation. So a specific type of bacteria gets a hold of that iron, we get an uh-oh type of situation. So it's a really good idea to keep it attached to these proteins so they can't really quite get to it. Now, not enzymes, proteins that carry it around is called transferrin. An easy way to remember what transferrin does, remember that trans can be transport, and it is transferring iron throughout the body. Ferrin also refers to iron. Ferrin, so you're transferring iron. If you're wanting to store it outside of the bones, or maybe in your liver or spleen, or maybe in a macrophage, you will find this protein that's attached to it. It's called a ferritin. Ferritin ferrets away iron. Ferrets, if they kill something and they're full though, they're going to go ahead and hide it somewhere. That's the same thing with ferritin. It's hiding away or stowing away this iron. It is the word, there is actually a word that's called ferreting away. So you are ferreting away iron in your liver or in your spleen or in your bones eventually and into your blood cells. Now that we've talked iron, let's talk that really weird ring structure that was around that iron. What we got to do, what your liver does or what your spleen does if you still have it, will transform and kick out that ring, and then that bilirubin is sent to the liver to be excreted. That bilirubin is excreted out into the small intestine with, you guessed it, bile. So bilirubin is excreted with bile. Bile. Bilirubin, bile. Hopefully that kind of drives home the fact what this is. Bilirubin is hydrophobic, so it makes it really hard to pee out. So anything that's hydrophobic and it's a waste product has to go out to your posterior or defecate it out. Once it's reached the small intestine, there are some bacteria that might go, delicious, I love the bilirubin. And it'll go ahead and process it into urobilinogen, which, if urobilin is created from it, is more hydrophilic and can be absorbed into your blood system again, which then is secreted out as your urine. Other stuff like the I can't believe I'm having a struggle. Stercobilin is excreted out in feces because it's still hydrophobic. So that is the life and death of your red blood cells. Just a quick reminder, quick overview. If you are experiencing hypoxic conditions, some specific cells inside your kidneys sense an issue, which then sends out erythropoietin, which tells the pro-erythroblasts in your red bone marrow to go ahead and mature up and become reticulocytes, which excretes more red blood cells, which helps you transport out even more oxygen, and that increase in oxygen and sort of a negative feedback that shuts down the creation of more erythropoietin, and aka, and thus also erythrocytes. With that, we will go ahead and be talking about the very basics of white blood cells, what they are, and how to identify them in the next video.